When the order was given, it wasn't shouted. It wasn't written down. It was delivered the way real power always moved in Harlem. Quiet, final, and understood by everyone who mattered. The man who received it didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't ask why. He had been standing behind Bumpy Johnson long enough to know that when the room went silent like this, history was about to be corrected. Outside, Harlem breathed in the late-night air, street lamps humming, jazz leaking through cracked windows, footsteps echoing off brick like whispered warnings. Inside a narrow back room above a Lenox Avenue storefront, the tension was so thick it pressed against the walls. Bumpy Johnson stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at his streets. He wasn't angry. That was the dangerous part. His face carried the calm of a man who had already weighed every consequence and found them acceptable. Behind him stood the man who would carry out the order. A loyal shadow. A bodyguard who understood that loyalty in Harlem wasn't measured by words, but by what you were willing to do when silence fell. "Handle it," Bumpy said quietly. That was all. No names spoken, no instructions repeated. Just two words, heavy enough to tilt the balance of power across an entire neighborhood. Within 24 hours, the streets would feel it. Within days, the city would be talking. And within weeks, the consequences of that single order would shake Harlem in ways no one could ignore. But to understand why that order mattered, why one man acting on Bumpy Johnson's will could change everything, you had to understand who Bumpy Johnson was long before that night. You had to understand the legend. By the late 1940s, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name in Harlem. He was infrastructure. He was the invisible line no one crossed unless they were prepared to lose something they couldn't replace. Respect, territory, or future. Harlem in those years was a paradox. Music spilled from every corner, culture bloomed in every club, and ambition lived in every alley. But it was also a battleground between numbers runners, Italian crime families, politicians, police, and men who believed power could be taken instead of earned. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe that. He believed power was organized. He had grown up watching chaos destroy men faster than bullets ever could. So he built something different, a system, a balance. Italians handled what Italians handled. Harlem handled Harlem. And Bumpy stood in the middle, not as a tyrant, but as a broker of order. The Italians respected him because he didn't bluff. The police tolerated him because the streets stayed quieter when he was in charge. And Harlem trusted him because he protected what mattered: families, businesses, dignity. That trust was everything, which is why the challenge that arrived that winter wasn't just an insult, it was a test. The man who caused it wasn't foolish. He wasn't reckless. That made him dangerous. He had connections, ambition, and just enough success to believe Harlem was ready for new leadership, his leadership. He started small, leaning on a few number spots, interrupting supply lines, speaking Bumpy's name without permission. Then he did the one thing no one did without consequences. He tried to embarrass the legend publicly. At a club meeting meant to discuss territory boundaries, the man laughed loudly in front of witnesses and suggested casually that Bumpy Johnson was getting old, that Harlem needed new blood. That respect was something you could renegotiate. The room went quiet then too. Bumpy didn't respond. He didn't threaten. He didn't even look at the man. And that silence, that calm, spread fear faster than any outburst ever could. Because everyone in that room knew something the challenger didn't yet understand. Bumpy Johnson never reacted immediately. He responded deliberately. For 3 days, nothing happened. The challenger mistook that for weakness. He moved more aggressively, claimed corners that weren't his, pressured people who had been under Bumpy's protection for years. He wanted to prove a point, that the legend was just a story, and stories faded. But Harlem had a long memory, and it remembered what happened to men who misunderstood silence. Behind the scenes, Bumpy watched. He listened. He let the man expose himself fully, his roots, his habits, his confidence. Only then did Bumpy decide the response, not public humiliation, not negotiation, finality. That was when he called his bodyguard into the room. The man wasn't flashy, no reputation of his own, no hunger for attention. He had grown up in Harlem too. He knew the rules. He knew the cost of breaking them. And he understood something most men never did, that being trusted by Bumpy Johnson meant carrying the weight of the entire neighborhood on your actions. When Bumpy gave the order, the bodyguard nodded once. He knew what came next wouldn't just settle a dispute. It would reset the city's understanding of authority. And somewhere in Harlem, a man who thought the legend was fading was about to learn a truth the streets had known for years. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to pull the trigger himself. The streets would shake anyway. The moment was already in motion. The bodyguard didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment after the order, the hum of Harlem drifting in through the window like a reminder of what was at stake. Bumpy Johnson remained facing the street, unmoving, as if the city itself was speaking to him. "You know why this can't linger," Bumpy said at last, his voice low, measured. "Yes," the bodyguard replied. "That man thinks time is on his side," Bumpy continued. "Men like that grow bold when they think silence means fear." The bodyguard nodded again. In Harlem, misunderstanding silence was the fastest way to erase yourself. When he finally stepped out into the night, the city greeted him like it always did, unassuming, watchful, alive with hidden currents. Street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. A saxophone cried somewhere in the distance. The rhythm of Harlem didn't change for anyone, but it always noticed when something important was about to happen. The bodyguard moved without urgency. Urgency drew attention. Attention created complications. And Bumpy Johnson didn't tolerate complications. By morning, word had already begun to spread. Not openly, not recklessly, but in the coded language of the streets. Something was coming. The challenger's name was being spoken less casually now. Men who had been eager to align themselves with him suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Fear didn't arrive loudly. It arrived in hesitation. The challenger, however, didn't notice or chose not to. He woke that morning convinced he was winning. His people told him Bumpy hadn't responded, that no message had been sent, that the streets were still open. He took that as confirmation that he had judged the moment correctly. Confidence, when built on ignorance, becomes arrogance. By midday, he made another mistake. He summoned a numbers runner who had long operated under Bumpy's protection and demanded a larger cut. The runner refused, calmly, respectfully, and when the challenger pressed harder, the runner said 4 words that ended the conversation. "I answer to Bumpy." The challenger smiled. "Not anymore," he replied. That was when the runner knew things had gone too far. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply left and went straight to the man who had kept him safe for years. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When the runner finished, Bumpy nodded once and dismissed him. The decision had already been made. That evening, Harlem felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just aware. Storefronts closed earlier. Conversations lowered their volume. Men checked who was behind them before they spoke. The challenger noticed that too, and mistook it for momentum. He chose a location that night that told everyone exactly how confident he felt. A narrow alley near a club he believed he controlled now. A place where messages were sent without witnesses who talked too much. He arrived surrounded by men, laughing, relaxed, playing the role of someone who believed he had already won. What he didn't see was the order that had been set in motion days earlier finally reaching its destination. The bodyguard had been watching him for hours, not stalking, observing. He noted patterns, timings, who stayed alert and who got careless. He saw the challenger's men relax as the night deepened, confidence softening their edges. That was when the bodyguard understood why Bumpy had chosen him. Because discipline mattered more than emotion in moments like this. The alley grew quiet, not suddenly, but naturally. Conversations drifted away. Footsteps faded. The city created space, the way it always did when something irreversible approached. The challenger was mid-sentence when the sound cut through the night. Sharp, absolute, unmistakable. It wasn't chaos that followed. It was stillness. Men froze. Breaths stopped halfway through lungs. The challenger's smile vanished, not replaced by panic but by disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes when a man realizes, too late, that the rules he thought he had rewritten were never his to touch. The bodyguard stood exactly where he had planned to stand, not rushing, not shouting, not explaining. The moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to the message. When it was over, he didn't linger. Lingering turned actions into spectacle, and Bumpy Johnson didn't build power through spectacle. By the time the bodyguard vanished back into Harlem's veins, the alley had already become something else. A lesson. Within an hour, the story had changed hands a dozen times. Each retelling stripped away unnecessary detail and left only what mattered. The challenge had been answered. Not by Bumpy's voice, not by Bumpy's hand, but by Bumpy's authority. By morning, the city woke cautiously. Men who had aligned themselves with the challenger pretended they hadn't. Debts were repaid early. Apologies were offered before they were requested. Even the Italians, watching from their own networks, took note. This wasn't reckless. This wasn't emotional. This was organized power reminding everyone how it operated. Bumpy Johnson walked the streets later that day like he always did, unhurried, composed, acknowledging people with a nod or a glance. The bodyguard followed, silent as ever. No one mentioned the alley. They didn't need to. Harlem understood something had been corrected. But what the city didn't yet understand, what would take days to fully settle, was what came next. Because the shot itself wasn't the end. It was the beginning of consequences that would ripple far beyond one man's ambition. And in quiet rooms across Harlem, men began asking the same question. If this was how Bumpy Johnson responded to disrespect, what would happen to anyone who tried again? The answer hadn't arrived yet, but it was already on its way. Men who had once measured opportunity now measured distance. Distance from the challenger, distance from the alley, distance from any decision that might place them on the wrong side of Bumpy Johnson's order. The streets didn't erupt into panic. They adjusted with precision, the way a seasoned operation does when it recognizes a shift in command. The challenger survived the night, but survival did not mean escape. In Harlem, survival after defiance carried a heavier burden than defeat. It meant you had to live knowing exactly where you stood and how quickly that position could change. He woke in a borrowed apartment, blinds drawn tight, the room heavy with the smell of stale smoke and fear. His men sat scattered, quieter than usual. No jokes, no confidence, just the unspoken realization that they had misjudged the city they were trying to conquer. One of them finally spoke. "This ain't over," he said, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The challenger didn't answer right away. His bravado from the night before had thinned into calculation. He knew the streets. He knew reputations. And he knew what it meant when Bumpy Johnson chose not to speak publicly. Silence in Harlem was never empty. By noon, a representative from an Italian family requested a meeting, not with the challenger, but with one of Bumpy's trusted intermediaries. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Alliances were being reconsidered. Bumpy received the report calmly. "They're watching," one lieutenant said, trying to understand if this was personal or policy. Bumpy leaned back slightly, eyes steady. It was policy the moment he forced my hand. That distinction mattered. Personal disputes ended quietly. Policy shifts reshaped entire neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the bodyguard remained invisible. That invisibility was intentional. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men chasing power never did. Enforcement lost value when it sought recognition. The man who carried out the order returned to being a shadow, his role complete for now. The streets didn't need to see him again to remember what he represented. And they remembered. A Numbers house on 142nd Street adjusted its payments without being asked. A club owner who had been slow to show respect suddenly became generous. A local politician postponed a meeting that would have pressed Bumpy's operation too hard. These weren't coincidences. They were reactions. The challenger felt them all. Doors closed. Calls went unanswered. Men who had once nodded eagerly now avoided eye contact. Even the police presence around him shifted. Not aggressive, not helpful, just observant. The kind of attention that suggested no one would step in if things went badly again. That afternoon, the challenger made his final mistake. He sent word requesting a meeting, not through proper channels, not with humility, but framed as negotiation. Bumpy listened to the request without interruption. When it was finished, he asked one question. Did he apologize? The messenger hesitated. No. Bumpy nodded once. Then there's nothing to discuss. The answer traveled back quickly, and with it came understanding. That evening, Bumpy gathered a small circle, not for planning, but for confirmation. The decision had already been executed. What remained was containment. Make sure nobody else gets ideas, he said calmly. No more demonstrations. The city's already listening. That was the paradox of true authority. The less it acted, the more powerful it became. The challenger realized too late that he was isolated, not surrounded, not hunted, but abandoned. Harlem had rejected him quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Every path he tried to take led back to the same realization. He had challenged the wrong man. The bodyguard reappeared only once during those days, not in the streets, not in an alley, but in a doorway. The challenger saw him across the street, standing still, watching, not threatening, not approaching, just present. That was enough. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what wouldn't happen again. The challenger left Harlem within 48 hours. No announcement, no retaliation, no final stand. He simply disappeared from the city's calculations, and Harlem closed the ledger on him. In the days that followed, the streets settled into a new rhythm. Not calmer, but clearer. Boundaries that had blurred were redrawn. Loyalties that had wavered were reaffirmed. Bumpy Johnson's authority didn't expand, it clarified. The Italians adjusted their operations. Smaller crews realigned themselves. Young men watching from the edges learned a lesson no one had to teach out loud. Power didn't need to shout. It needed to be understood. Bumpy walked Lenox Avenue one evening as the sun dipped low, the city glowing around him. People nodded. Some smiled. Some looked away. All of them knew where they stood. The bodyguard followed a step behind, invisible again. What the streets didn't yet realize was that the real consequence hadn't fully arrived. Because when authority is challenged publicly, restoration is only the first step. The second step, the one that truly reshaped history, was about to begin. And it wouldn't take place in an alley. It would take place in rooms where decisions were made, by men who now understood exactly what Bumpy Johnson represented. The meeting took place in a room that had seen too many decisions to remember them all. A back office above a social club on Lenox Avenue, wood-paneled walls darkened by decades of smoke. A single table, 3 chairs, no windows. The kind of place where voices stayed low and consequences stayed high. This wasn't about the challenger anymore. This was about what his mistake had exposed. Bumpy Johnson arrived without ceremony. No entourage, no show of strength, just his presence, and that was enough to change the temperature in the room. 2 men were already seated when he entered. One represented the Italian families operating north of Midtown. Clean suit, polished manners, eyes sharp enough to miss nothing. The other was local, political, connected, accustomed to believing he stood above the streets. Both men stood when Bumpy entered. That alone said everything. Bumpy didn't acknowledge the gesture. He took the seat at the head of the table, rested his hands calmly, and waited. Silence stretched. The Italian spoke first. "We wanted to clear misunderstandings," he said carefully. "Recent events have caused concern." Bumpy looked at him without hostility. "Concern comes from confusion," he replied. "Confusion comes from people forgetting where they are." The political figure shifted uncomfortably. "No one's forgetting anything," he said. "But there are questions about how far authority extends." That was the challenge, not loud, not disrespectful, but dangerous. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "Authority extends as far as responsibility," he said, "and I've carried Harlem's longer than anyone in this room." The Italian nodded once. He understood the language of power. "The incident," he said, choosing his words carefully, "was decisive, but some worry it sets a precedent." Bumpy's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but focus. "It reminds people of one," he said. "There's a difference." The political figure tried again. "Men are nervous. When enforcement happens without warning, it unsettles business. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Business thrives on order, he said. Disrespect disrupts it. The room went quiet. Then the Italian spoke the words that mattered. So this wasn't personal? Bumpy answered immediately. No. That answer carried more weight than any threat, because personal conflicts ended. Policy endured. The Italian leaned back, considering. And if someone else tests that policy? Bumpy's response was calm, almost instructional. Then they'll learn the same lesson, and the city will move on. At that moment, the door opened quietly. The bodyguard entered, not abruptly, not dramatically. He took a position near the wall, hands visible, posture relaxed. He didn't look at anyone directly, but both men noticed. The political figure swallowed. I see, he said quietly. That was the peak. Not an argument, not a raised voice, but understanding landing all at once. The Italian stood. There will be no retaliation, he said. No confusion. Harlem remains yours. Bumpy stood as well. Harlem remains orderly, he corrected. That's what matters. The meeting ended without handshakes. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that a boundary had just been permanently redrawn. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly but unmistakably. Italian operations adjusted routes. Political pressure eased. Police oversight shifted its focus elsewhere. And the bodyguard, now known without being named, became a presence felt even when unseen. Men didn't ask who he was. They asked where he might be. That alone kept order. One afternoon, a younger lieutenant asked Bumpy a question he'd been holding back. Why him? The lieutenant asked. Why trust that kind of authority to someone else? Bumpy didn't answer right away. Because power that can't be delegated isn't real, he said finally, and loyalty without judgment is useless. That was the truth at the center of everything. The bodyguard hadn't acted out of impulse. He hadn't sought approval. He had understood the moment and the cost of hesitation. Harlem respected that. Weeks passed. The city settled into its recalibrated rhythm. The challenger was gone. His name faded quickly. Harlem had no use for men who didn't learn. But the story didn't fade. It sharpened. Men told it carefully, not exaggerated, not glorified, just factual. He crossed a line. The order was given. The response was immediate, and the city adjusted. That was how legends solidified, not through repetition, but through acceptance. One night, Bumpy stood on his balcony overlooking Lenox Avenue, lights stretching into the distance. The bodyguard stood behind him, quiet as always. You did what needed doing, Bumpy said without turning. The bodyguard nodded once. I understand. That was all that needed to be said. Because in Harlem, understanding mattered more than praise. The confrontation had ended not with chaos, but clarity. And that clarity would ripple outward into every deal, every negotiation, every unspoken calculation for years to come. Justice in Harlem never arrived with ceremony. It arrived quietly, measured in changed behavior, altered routes, and decisions that never needed to be spoken aloud. The days following the confrontation didn't bring sirens or headlines. They brought something far more telling: compliance. Corners that once flirted with defiance fell back into line. Numbers runners adjusted their schedules without being told. Club owners who had once tested limits suddenly found reasons to be cooperative. Men who liked to posture now preferred silence. The city had absorbed the lesson. The challenger's disappearance from Harlem life was complete. No one mentioned his name openly, not out of fear, but irrelevance. Harlem had a way of erasing men who mistook audacity for power. What remained was order. Bumpy Johnson watched it all unfold without interference. He didn't tighten his grip. He didn't loosen it either. Authority, when applied correctly, didn't require constant reinforcement. It simply reshaped the environment. One afternoon, a respected shopkeeper on 135th Street pulled Bumpy aside. "Things feel calmer," the man said carefully. "Like folks remember where the lines are." Bumpy nodded. "Lines don't move," he said. "People just forget they exist." The bodyguard stood nearby, unobtrusive but present. The shopkeeper glanced at him briefly, then lowered his eyes. That reaction had become common. Not fear, recognition. Law enforcement noticed the shift as well. Patrols became less aggressive, more observational. Officers who had once looked for opportunities to provoke quietly redirected their attention elsewhere. Harlem wasn't worth stirring when it governed itself. A precinct captain remarked privately, "Johnson's neighborhood is too organized to disrupt. Someone's keeping things contained." He wasn't wrong. Contained didn't mean peaceful. It meant controlled. Within Bumpy's inner circle, the tone shifted too. Younger lieutenants learned restraint. Older ones reaffirmed loyalty. Nobody questioned decisions anymore. They studied them. One evening, a lieutenant brought troubling news. "There's talk," he said. "Some out-of-town operators think the situation created an opening. They think the streets are tense." Bumpy listened patiently. "People confuse tension with weakness," he replied. "Let them." The lieutenant hesitated. "What if they push?" Bumpy's eyes flicked briefly toward the bodyguard, then back. "Then the city reminds them," he said. That was justice in Harlem. Not revenge, not cruelty. Correction. A week later, the test came. 2 men from Brooklyn tried to establish a foothold near a long-standing numbers house. They were polite, professional, careful, but careless in one crucial way. They didn't ask. The bodyguard noticed first. He didn't move immediately. He watched patterns, timing, posture. He waited until certainty replaced suspicion. Then he stepped forward. No confrontation, no raised voice, just presence. The men stopped talking mid-sentence. One of them recognized him, his face drained of color. "We didn't mean," the man began. "You should leave," the bodyguard said calmly. They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They left. Word spread faster than the incident itself, not about what almost happened, but about what didn't. That was justice refined, preventing escalation without spectacle. Bumpy approved silently. That night, he addressed his inner circle. "You see the difference?" he asked. "This city doesn't need constant force. It needs clarity." The men nodded. "The streets remember consequences," Bumpy continued, "but they respect restraint even more." The bodyguard remained still, understanding the weight of what had been accomplished. He had become an instrument of balance, not just enforcement. Harlem responded accordingly. Residents felt safer walking home. Businesses thrived under predictability. Even those who operated in gray areas understood the boundaries clearly. Justice, when applied correctly, benefited everyone, even those who resented it. One afternoon, an Italian intermediary requested a meeting. He arrived with humility. "No grievances," he said, "just acknowledgement." Bumpy listened. "Harlem is stable," the man continued. We respect that." Bumpy nodded once. "Stability is expensive," he said, "and I pay that cost daily." The intermediary understood the message. Outside interests would respect Harlem's autonomy or stay away. That agreement held. The bodyguard's reputation evolved quietly. He was no longer discussed as an enforcer. He was referred to as a measure. If he's around, the matter's settled. That was justice achieved without excess. Weeks turned into months. The memory of the initial confrontation softened, but its effect hardened into routine. Men adjusted their ambitions. Disputes resolved earlier. Challenges diminished before they formed. The city didn't forget the moment, but it no longer needed to relive it. One evening, Bumpy and the bodyguard shared a rare, quiet moment in a private club after hours. "You did exactly what was needed," Bumpy said, "and no more." The bodyguard nodded. "That's how you taught me." That acknowledgement mattered, because justice wasn't about dominance. It was about alignment. Harlem aligned itself once more. The power dynamics had shifted decisively, not through chaos, but through consequence delivered with precision. And as the city settled into its recalibrated order, one truth became clear to anyone paying attention. Bumpy Johnson didn't rule through fear. He ruled through certainty. And when certainty was challenged, justice answered. Not loudly, not often, but unmistakably. The key streets had learned. And Harlem, once again, moved forward, knowing exactly who held the balance. Legends aren't crowned in the moment they act. They're confirmed in the silence that follows. When time passes, tempers cool, and the outcome still stands. Months after the confrontation, Harlem moved with a steadiness that hadn't been felt in years. Not because conflict had vanished, but because uncertainty had. The rules were no longer whispered or debated. They were understood. And that understanding traced back to one decision, one order, one response carried out with discipline. Bumpy Johnson's name traveled farther than his presence. In back rooms downtown and private offices uptown, men spoke of Harlem differently now. Not as contested ground, not as opportunity, as a fixed point. "Johnson's territory is settled," one union fixer remarked. "You don't negotiate there. You adapt." That reputation mattered. It kept opportunists at bay more effectively than any show of force ever could. For the bodyguard, the change was subtler but deeper. He no longer stood as a symbol of action. He stood as proof of resolve. Younger men studied how he moved, not aggressively, but deliberately. They noticed what he didn't do as much as what he did. No unnecessary gestures, no indulgence in attention. He embodied restraint with consequences. An elder in the community summed it up one Sunday afternoon outside a church on Lenox Avenue. "That man," the elder said quietly, "keeps trouble from thinking it belongs here." That was legacy taking root. Bumpy watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction. He understood something many men in power never did. Authority only becomes legendary when it outlives the moment that created it. He began shifting focus, less on enforcement, more on infrastructure, supporting businesses, mediating disputes before they hardened, investing in people who kept Harlem functioning. The confrontation had bought him something invaluable, time, and he used it. Historians would later argue about Bumpy Johnson's methods, his morality, his contradictions. But even critics acknowledged one thing without hesitation. Harlem under Bumpy was different, not peaceful, but protected. The bodyguard's role evolved as well. He became an advisor more than an enforcer. When disputes arose, his presence alone often resolved them. Men adjusted their tone. Meetings ended early, not because he demanded it, because they remembered. There were moments, rare ones, when someone tried to test the myth. A sharp comment, a sideways challenge, a refusal dressed up as a pride. Those moments never escalated. They evaporated under steady eye contact and calm certainty. That was the true inheritance of the earlier action. Bumpy once explained it to a trusted confidant. Anyone can create fear in a day, he said. But respect takes consistency. It takes memory. Harlem remembered. Years later, long after the original challenger had faded from relevance, the story still circulated, changed slightly with each telling, but anchored by the same truth. Someone had tested the balance. The balance responded, and the city adjusted. No exaggeration, no theatrics, just consequence. Even law enforcement adapted. New officers learned quickly which streets required diplomacy instead of bravado. Veterans quietly passed down advice. Observe more, interfere less. That wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. Bumpy Johnson had created a system that enforced itself. The bodyguard, now older and more seasoned, understood his place in that legacy. He wasn't the legend, he was the proof. The proof that loyalty, discipline, and restraint could shape a city as effectively as ambition and force. One evening, as Harlem lights flickered on and storefronts closed for the night, Bumpy stood at his window overlooking the streets. "They'll argue about me someday," he said. "They'll argue about what I stood for." The bodyguard remained silent. "But they won't argue about this," Bumpy continued, gesturing outward. "They'll see what order looks like." That was legacy, not statues, not headlines, not mythology divorced from reality. Legacy was Harlem continuing to breathe under rules it understood. As years passed, new names rose and fell. New challenges emerged and disappeared. But the template remained. Respect earned, boundaries enforced, justice delivered without excess. That was the world shaped by one defining response, and the discipline that followed it. And when people spoke of Bumpy Johnson in later years, they didn't start with what he took. They started with what he controlled. Because legends aren't remembered for moments of chaos. They're remembered for the order they leave behind. This wasn't just a story about one order carried out on a Harlem street. It was about a system responding to disrespect and the price of misreading power. Too often, history reduces men like Bumpy Johnson to headlines and labels. It strips away context, community, and consequence. But Harlem remembered something deeper. It remembered a man who understood that authority without discipline collapses into chaos, and discipline without purpose becomes cruelty. What shook the streets wasn't the act itself. It was the certainty that followed. From that moment forward, people moved differently. They spoke more carefully. They measured their intentions, not because they were afraid of a reaction, but because they respected the balance that had been enforced. And that distinction matters. Fear fades. Respect endures. The bodyguard never sought recognition. His role was never about visibility. It was about alignment, being exactly where history required him to be, and nowhere else. In doing so, he became part of something larger than himself, a lesson etched into the rhythm of Harlem. This story endures because it speaks to a universal truth. Power is always being tested, Authority is always being challenged, and respect is never given freely. It's earned, reinforced, and remembered. For Harlem, this wasn't about domination. It was about dignity, about drawing a line so the community didn't have to live in constant reaction. About reminding the world that order, when rooted in understanding, can protect as much as it controls. And that's why the story still echoes. Not because of what happened in a single moment, but because of what didn't happen afterward. Sometimes history turns on noise, but sometimes it turns on silence. The kind of silence that tells everyone listening